In the following video, I'll be discussing the life and method of perhaps my greatest hero in the area of overcoming diabetes, Dr. Richard Bernstein. In a day when almost nobody was testing their glucose, as a type 1 diabetic, Dr. Bernstein, long before he ever thought about becoming a doctor, got hold of a very primitive 3-pound glucose meter and began testing his glucose like crazy. What he discovered has been the source of vast multitudes finding victory over diabetes and living long, healthy lives. Some of you who've been helped by me to get your blood glucose down may have assumed that I'm just a new guy who's appeared with my own new ideas about diabetes and blood sugar. But the truth is, I'm simply following in the footsteps of a number of brilliant doctors and researchers who knew these things long before I ever did. But who is the first? I'm not sure that anybody would ever be able to answer that question. We could talk about Robert Atkins, or we could go back all the way to the early 20th century and discuss some of the doctors who were encouraging the reduction or elimination of starches and sweets. Or we could go all the way back into the 1800s and look at William Banting, who wrote a pamphlet that became hugely popular, where he recommended a diet minus starches and sweets for weight loss. But many of these guys were far more concerned with weight loss than they were with diabetes. In this video, I want to talk about a man who essentially pioneered the low-carb approach specifically for diabetes. And the reason he was so focused on diabetes was that he was a diabetic himself. In fact, a type 1 diabetic. I'm talking about Dr. Richard Bernstein, to whom the diabetic world owes an enormous debt. Today, I want to look at where he got his ideas and the roots and the foundation of his low-carb approach to diabetes, which has become a worldwide phenomenon today. Richard Bernstein became a type 1 diabetic in 1946, a long time ago, at the age of 12. In those days, type 1 diabetes was a terrible affliction that would almost certainly shorten one's life by several decades at a minimum. The fact that he is still alive today and practicing medicine at the age of 85 is a pretty powerful testimony to the effectiveness of his methods of diabetic control. After his diagnosis of type 1 diabetes, Richard spent the next 22 years doing what the doctors instructed him, and having blood sugars soaring sky high and then dropping so low he could barely function. His doctors put him on a high-carb, low-fat diet which virtually guaranteed monstrous fluctuations in his blood sugar. He took insulin, of course, as a type 1, but it could not possibly keep up with all the carbs that he was eating. Plus, there was no way he could precisely match his insulin dosage with the high-carb meals that he was eating. His blood sugar highs and lows took a terrible toll on him. He developed serious kidney disease, frozen shoulders, and infections of all kinds. He was constantly taking antibiotics to deal with the infections. He had night blindness so bad that when he entered a movie theater, he'd have to sit in the nearest chair for up to half an hour, just waiting for his vision to adjust to the darkness, after which he could finally walk down to the middle section and actually see the seats. Bernstein's growth was stunted, and he never achieved either the height or weight of the boys and later the men who were his age. Try as he might, he could never get any heavier than 115 pounds. His life changed, and indeed the life of many diabetics who've been helped by him since then, including myself when he saw an advertisement for a blood sugar meter in the back of a medical magazine. Now, Bernstein wasn't a doctor yet at this time, but he had subscribed to this magazine when he had worked as a medical supplier of hospitals. Until then, the only way to know your blood glucose levels was to go to the doctor and have him take your blood and send it off to a laboratory. But in this magazine, there was an ad for a machine which could test your blood on the spot and within 1 minute tell you what your glucose levels were. Richard was fascinated, and he wondered if this machine could help him with some of his diabetic woes. The problem was that it wasn't available to the general public, and it was sold only to doctors and hospitals. However, Richard was married at this point, and his wife just happened to be a doctor. Using her stationery with her permission, he ordered the 3-pound blood sugar testing machine for the price of $650, which is over $4,000 in today's money. When it arrived, he immediately put it to use, testing himself over and over again. He wanted to know what raises blood sugar, how does insulin lower blood sugar, and by how much. His most urgent concern was to see if this device, this ancient ancestor of our modern little Mike the blood sugar meter, could help him stop these terrible diabetic complications. For 3 years, he tested and tested and tested himself and seemed to make almost no improvement. His physical problems showed no signs of letting up, he gained no weight, and there was no indication that for all his testing he was really doing himself any good. But at this point, he had not yet seen the need to truly normalize his blood sugar. He had been assuming that he could fix most of his diabetic problems through exercise, and he had lifted weights like crazy. But it made no difference in anything. But everything changed when, as he researched diabetes, he saw an article which suggested that tests in animals revealed that diabetic complications had been prevented and sometimes reversed, not through exercise, but through bringing their blood sugars into the normal range. This possibility was thrilling to young Bernstein. If it worked in animals, could it not work in humans? He talked to his doctors, who threw cold water on his query and told him that humans were not animals, and furthermore it was, in their minds, impossible to get a diabetic's blood sugar, and especially a type 1 diabetic, into the normal range. But Richard Bernstein had a bit of the rebel in him, as most folks do who beat diabetes. He wanted to find out for himself whether this could personally work in his own life. He wrote, "Since I had been trained as an engineer, not as a physician, I knew nothing of such impossibilities. And since I was desperate, I had no choice but to pretend I was an animal." Over the next year, he tested himself more and more and made various adjustments to his diet. He says, if a change brought an improvement, I'd retain it. If it made the blood sugar worse, I'd discard it. I discovered that 1 gram of carbohydrate raised my blood sugar by 5 milligrams per deciliter, and 1/2 unit of the old beef-pork insulin lowered it by 15 milligrams per deciliter. Within 1 year, he had his answer. By constant testing and making changes in his diet based on his tests, within a year he had his blood glucose down into the normal range. No more crazy highs, no more scary lows, just beautiful, normal, stable blood sugar. He had cut his necessary insulin by 2/3, and many of his diabetic complications reversed themselves, and those that remained did not get worse. Bernstein wrote, "I had the new sensation of being the boss of my own metabolic state, and began to feel the same sense of accomplishment and reward I had in engineering, when I solved a difficult problem. I had taught myself how to make my blood sugar levels whatever I wanted them to be, and was no longer on the roller coaster. Things were under my control." Bernstein had found an answer to his own diabetic woes using an ancient ancestor of Mike the Meter, and as he read diabetic magazines, he found it very strange that the virtually unanimous opinion of the doctors of his day was that, number 1, it's impossible for diabetics to achieve normal blood sugar, and 2, even if it were possible, it was definitely not desirable, and any attempt to do that would cause more harm than good. Bernstein writes, "How was it that I, an engineer, had figured out how to do what was impossible for medical professionals?" The eating plan he'd worked out was simple. Cut the carbs so low that you could precisely determine how much insulin it would take to cover those carbs, and then take the necessary and appropriate insulin. In practice, this worked out to be about 30 grams of carbs per day. For his breakfast, he would limit his carbs to 6 grams. For lunch and dinner, he would allow himself 12 grams of carbs per meal. By knowing exactly how many grams of carbohydrate he was dealing with, and determining just how low a unit of insulin would take his blood sugar and just how high a gram of carb would raise his blood sugar, he could match the carbs in his meals with the fast-acting insulin he took before the meals. Additionally, he took slow-acting insulin a couple of times each day. Bernstein's success made him euphoric. He had to tell the whole world. He naively assumed that all the medical world would be thrilled right along with him at this new approach to type 1 diabetes, and that soon diabetics all over the world would be using his new method. But to his surprise, no doctor and no medical expert seemed to be the least bit interested in what he had to say. Number one, he was not a doctor, so what could he possibly tell them? And second, everybody already knew that diabetics could not possibly achieve normal blood sugar, and that it was both foolish and dangerous to even try. A third argument was that testing their own blood sugar was something that no diabetics would have the least interest in doing. Who ever heard of a diabetic patient acting as their own laboratory? In time, Richard realized that he would never get the respect he needed to publicize his method of dealing with diabetes unless he himself became a doctor. If you can't beat him, join him. And so at the age of 45, he went to medical school and became a doctor, specializing in the treatment of diabetes, both type 1 and type 2. Since then, he's written numerous books with the two famous diabetic classics, Diabetes Solution and Diabetes Type 2. Between his own medical practice and his books, his YouTube channel, his lectures, and other means, Dr. Richard Bernstein has probably helped more people to overcome diabetes than any other single person alive today. I ran across Richard Bernstein in an indirect fashion. When I was struggling terribly with runaway blood sugar, I first found someone who stated that a vegetarian, meatless diet would help me conquer diabetes. He seemed to make some sense, and so I cut meat out of my diet. As a result, I ate more carbs than before, and my blood sugar fluctuations seemed to grow 10 times worse. Finally, in desperation, I read a book by a lady named Margaret Blackstone who told of how she conquered diabetes. It turned out she was a patient of Richard Bernstein, who had informed her that she had to shave her carbohydrates very low. She did that and found victory. But as I read her book, I was confused and upset. I'd been sure that the answer was in a relatively high-carb, meatless diet, and now here I was reading that the answer was in a low-carb diet without worrying about meat. All I knew for sure was that my vegetarian diet was surely not working for me at all. So I figured I didn't have much to lose. And as I cut my carbs, I began to do what Dr. Richard Bernstein had done so many years earlier. I was blessed to have a meter that didn't cost me over $4,000. In fact, those early meters I used cost me about $20, and the strips were usually about $20 for 50 strips. It did not take long at all for me to recognize that Bernstein was right and the vegetarian approach, at least the high-carb vegetarian approach that I'd been using, was wrong. I quickly saw exactly what Richard Bernstein saw, which was something nobody can really contradict. Carbs raise blood sugar much faster and higher than protein, and fat hardly raises blood sugar at all. And as I tested and modified my diet, what happened to Richard Bernstein happened to me. I went from crazy extremes in my glucose levels to stable and close to normal blood sugar. Now, he was type 1 and I was potentially a type 2, but it was working for me. And as I became more and more careful in keeping my glucose under control, irritable bowel syndrome left me, frozen shoulders stopped, and my A1Cs became close to normal. So there you have it. As Paul Harvey might have said it, now you know the rest of the story. Strangely, after all these years, much of the medical establishment is still recommending the same worn-out, high-carb, high-spiking diet, which has never worked. I found it almost funny that on a website describing Dr. Bernstein's diet, it listed the pros and the cons of the diet. And one of the cons they listed was this: runs contrary to dietary guidelines for managing diabetes endorsed by major medical organizations. But things are changing, and the work that Dr. Bernstein has done and is still doing at the age of 85 at this time is doing a world of good and producing all kinds of little miniature Richard Bernsteins, and I'm proud to be one of them. I'll put a link to Bernstein's 2 major books, which you can purchase on Amazon, and also a link to his YouTube channel. Learn of this man, get his books, watch his videos, and be inspired. Now, the story I've been sharing with you and Dr. Bernstein's direct quotes have come from his book, Diabetes Solution. It would be worth the price of this book just for that one chapter alone, but it has far more good stuff than that, so I'd encourage you to get that book if you can. In the next video, you'll see an interview I did with Dr. Bill Thompson. Bill is an optometrist, and after identifying patients as diabetic through examining their eyes, he found that he himself was diabetic. But once he learned the lifestyle change he needed to make, he took it very, very seriously and thoroughly beat diabetes. Bill, welcome to Beat Diabetes.
Thank you, Dennis. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I've watched so many of your videos. I feel like we're old friends, but this is our first face-to-face.
That is right. And Bill, so often I'm curious what people do for a living. You are an optometrist.
That's correct, yes.
And I think the curious thing about this, we're going to talk about your own struggle with diabetes and how you found some answers, but you were not unfamiliar with diabetes. You saw patients that came in for eye checkups that you could pretty much detect they had some diabetic problems, right? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I see patients every day that are diabetics, and over the years, I've been practicing for getting close to 40 years now. I just turned 64 and still practicing full time, but over the years, I had seen people that didn't know that they were diabetic, and because of changes that they were having, kind of rapid changes that they were having in their vision, I examined their retinas real carefully, and sometimes we see little hemorrhages in the back of the eye. So there have been a number of times where I was the first person to ever mention to them that they're most likely diabetic, and of course then I recommended they go see their regular family physician and confirm that. And every time that's happened, every time I suspected that someone was diabetic over the years, it was confirmed by their family practitioner. And so I was definitely familiar with it and never wanted to be diabetic myself. My mother is one of 9 children, and all 9 of them are all type 2 diabetics, so I knew that it was a possibility.
So you had a huge family history of diabetes, and you saw diabetic patients constantly, and that you could pretty well tell, and you said your record is just about perfect, that whenever you'd tell them to go see their doctor, the doctor would confirm they were diabetic. Mm-hmm. You were not a stranger to diabetes.
Right.
You recognize that it could happen to you, I suppose, just from the family history. Tell us what happened when you discovered you yourself were diabetic and your emotional reaction to that.
Yeah, I was devastated, and I will get into the specifics of that, but I was devastated and kind of panicked because I know, some of the complications that diabetics can have. And so I was really devastated. But prior to that, I had stumbled across a couple of videos on YouTube. One was by Dr. Sarah Hallberg, where she did a TED Talk, and it went viral. She got over 3 million views on that, where she talked about working with obese patients, most of whom were diabetic, and that the way she succeeded with those patients was to ignore the guidelines from the American Diabetic Association. And that's almost heresy for a physician to say something like that, but she said that's the only way she achieved success with them. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, but again, I wasn't diagnosed as diabetic, but I filed it away. And then later on, I ran into Dr. Jason Fung, and he had a video where he's a nephrologist, as you know, I'm sure, and all of his patients are obese diabetics for the most part with severe kidney problems, and that was the first time I heard about intermittent fasting was from a video that he had made, and I learned that he had 3 books that he had written and all that. But again, I wasn't that motivated because I hadn't been diagnosed yet, and but as soon as I was diagnosed and panicked, I thought back to those 2 videos, so I went back and watched them over again and thought that perhaps there's some glimmer of hope that I can do this without the medication route. That was my goal, was to try to stay off of medication, because Dr. Fung talks about that once you get on medication, a lot of times it's kind of a downhill slope. You start off with a little bit of an oral medication like metformin, and then later you go to higher doses, and eventually you end up on insulin, and then eventually you end up in his clinic with severe kidney problems and other, eye problems and all sorts of things. And I certainly saw that in the patients that I see day to day, that they don't seem to get better, they seem to get worse. And so the idea that there might be some natural way to combat this thing was very appealing. And
now, tell us a little bit about your diagnosis. Was this just for a general checkup, or did you have a reason to think you might have diabetes?
No, I had gone in just for routine physical. I had put off my routine yearly physical for longer than I intended, but when I went in, I asked my doctor if he would run an A1C, because I always had that in the back of my mind. And previously he had only done fasting blood. He would have me come in fasting, and he would run fasting blood sugars. And there was one time when it was 100, and he seemed a little concerned about that, especially with my family history, but it had never been higher than 100. It was usually 97, 98, and then that one time it was 100, and he was a little concerned about that, but he said, yeah, an A1C would be a better test, so he ran it. And on November the 19th, I'll never forget the day, on November the 19th, 2018, about a year and a half ago, I went in for my results, and he went through page by page, because he ran a lot of different blood work. And but when he got to my blood sugar, to my A1C, he said, this is not good news. He said, this is a 9.9. And I knew enough about diabetes myself that I knew that's not only not good news, that's terrible news. And because in my own mind, I was thinking, when I was going in for my blood results, I said, I might have like a 7.6 or something, and that's not good news. I was preparing myself mentally for bad news, but I was thinking about a 7.6 would be bad news, but a 9.9, that was devastating.
But you had some kind of an inner instinct that maybe this is it, and sure enough, it was not just diabetic, but it was bad diabetic. 9.9 is really bad, and you knew enough to know it was really bad. Yes. Interesting thing to me is, before this diagnosis, before you knew you even had it, you had watched a Jason Fung video, you had watched a Sarah Hallberg, and I like both those guys, and they had strongly emphasized a low-carb approach, and Fung talks much about intermittent fasting. It's almost like God had prepared you and given you a little bit of a direction before you even knew you needed it.
I agree, because that did give me a glimmer of hope when I was devastated by the news. There was a little glimmer of hope that there was something that could be done about that. And on the low-carb approach, years ago, probably 25 years ago, when the Atkins diet was popular, I had bought Dr. Atkins' book and had tried to follow his information pretty closely, and I'd lost 35 pounds doing that. I wasn't as heavy then, but I had lost like 35 pounds following the Atkins diet. But so many people tried to frighten me, but you get so much different information from different people.
That's for sure.
And a number of people in my family are vegetarians. They're all diabetics, but a number of them are vegetarians for religious reasons, and they they were really against Atkins and his diet. And of course, then when he died, they said, see, you can't listen to Dr. Atkins.
So you get a 9.9. You know it's bad. You know it's really bad. You remember a couple of videos you watched. Did you kick into high gear and immediately say, man, I'm going to do this low-carb thing and I'm going to beat this? What was your attitude?
Well, I started searching YouTube more and stumbled onto your channel right away, and that was a lifesaver. And I believe that was God that directed me to your channel, because I got so much good information there, all the food tests that you do and all that sort of thing. I started right away there. As soon as I discovered your channel, I started testing my blood sugar all the time after meals and everything, the same way you do in your tests that you run. I did the banana test right away. That was one of your first videos, bananas versus candy bars. I didn't do the candy bars because I knew they'd be bad for me, but I thought, I'm going to see what bananas do to my blood sugar. And they did the same thing to me that they did to you. So
now, you ate 2 bananas or 1?
2.
Okay.
2. I did. I wanted to reproduce.
You remember what number you got?
I think it was like a 185 or something, which, of course I knew was terrible, and I don't remember exactly, but at that time, whenever I would test foods that I suspected weren't going to be good for me, those are the kind of numbers I was getting, and so I binge watched most of your videos and to try to get caught up on all of that, and just became convinced of how I needed to eat. And that, after getting some of the exact, very similar results to what you got, I just started trusting that I was going to react the way you did. I didn't want to test everything that you tested, especially in a short period of time.
So I became your guinea pig, right?
What's that?
I became your guinea pig?
Exactly, and I appreciate it. I really do.
I think I serve that for many people, actually. I try to tell them I'm not your guinea pig, but somehow I end up being that anyway.
Right. But I just became convinced, because like when your wife will do the same test, she doesn't react the same way that you do because she doesn't have the insulin resistance problems. But I could see that my pattern was very similar to yours when I would eat those types of foods. So anything that didn't work for you, I just left it out, and I gave up on fruits altogether. I know you say you can eat strawberries and some things like that, but I just didn't want to risk it. I thought, I'm just going to give up on all fruits. And
your doctor, did he prescribe any kind of medication when you got the 9.9?
No, I was fortunate that he prefers a lot of kind of natural and holistic type interventions himself as a first resort. I mean, he wouldn't hesitate to prescribe medication if that was the only choice we had. But he did say, to try. He didn't give me specifics about what to eat, but he did say, try to lose a little weight. And I said, how much? And he said, 30 pounds. He said, if you could lose 30 pounds, I bet your numbers would look a lot better. He said, I'll see you back in 3 months and we'll repeat the A1C and see how you're doing. And then as I was walking out, he was kind of looking me over and he said, let's make that 40 pounds. See if you can lose 40 pounds. Because that was.
What did you weigh at that time? Do you remember?
250. I weighed 250 pounds.
And you were how tall?
6'1".
Okay.
Yeah. And at any rate, you could see it all over, but especially in my neck. And I was diagnosed with sleep apnea and slept with a CPAP, which I don't need anymore. And so at any rate, with that instruction to try to lose 40 pounds, I got real serious. And because I had discovered intermittent fasting, I tried that right away. In fact, I even tried some longer term fasts. I did about 3 48-hour fasts, not back to back, of course. That'd be more than 48 hours, but 1 week. And then maybe take 2 weeks and do another 48-hour fast. And then I actually got up to a couple of 72-hour fasts. I didn't like that very much. I just didn't like the feeling and all. And I was also starting to get kind of lightheaded and dizzy doing those longer term fasts. But I have blood pressure cuffs where I can check my own blood pressure. So I checked my blood pressure, and my blood pressure was dropping too low. Way too low, and I was on two different medications for my blood pressure. I called my doctor and he said, well, let's drop that second one, which was a beta blocker. He said, let's drop that second one and see how you do. And I did a lot better. The lightheadedness and everything went away, and my blood pressure came back into more of a normal range. But then a little later on, the lightheadedness started, checked my blood pressure, it was too low. I called him and he said, let's drop both blood pressure medicines. He said, but just check your blood pressure, 2 or 3 times a day, every day, and make sure it's not getting too high. But that's the last time I've taken blood pressure medication, and don't take any blood pressure medication. I also used to be on cholesterol meds. I don't take medicine for anything anymore. I would if I really needed to, but I just haven't needed to, and don't need the CPAP for sleep apnea. I sleep so much better and have a lot more energy than I used to have.
Okay, let's go through. Normally you see a doctor, he says you've got diabetes, come back in 3 months, let's see where it goes. He may or may not prescribe medication. In your case, he didn't. During that 3-month time, did you get the feeling, I think I'm beating this thing, I think I'm winning? And when you went back the next time, 3 months later, were you excited? Were you just curious? What was your feeling as you went through those 3 months?
Yes, well, remember, because of your channel, I was checking my blood sugar with my meter. I was checking it constantly so I could see that I was doing better and better and better. And I was actually anxious to go get the next A1C run because I was just sure that it was going to be better. I was getting into the 70s and stuff with my blood sugar, and I thought...
As a fasting glucose.
Yes. And so I thought, this next A1C has got to be better.
Got to be better.
After meals, early on after meals, sometimes I was over 150, but that was starting to drop too. Because I was eating so low carb and everything, that had dropped way down, and now, 110, 115 would be about an hour after a meal. But my fasting was in the 70s and low 80s, and so I thought, this is going to be good. I was anxious to get that A1C, and when I went in, it ended up being April the 5th, which was closer to 4 months just because of my scheduling and his scheduling. I came in at 4 months rather than 3 months, and I was anxious to see those results, and he got the results back real quickly, and he was thrilled. He was shocked and thrilled to tell me, you're now at a 4.9, from a 9.9 to a 4.9. He said in all of his years of practice, he's older than I am. He's in his 70s, I believe now, and he said, in all my years of practice, I've never seen that happen. I've never seen someone go from a 9.9 to a 4.9, cut it in half, basically, your A1C, and do it without medication. He said, I just haven't seen, he said, I don't see those kind of results with medication, let alone without medication. And so he was thrilled.
Imagine you were a little bit thrilled yourself.
I was, and, I became excited to share that information with other people because I see so many patients in my own office that are diabetic, and so they were all asking, what's happened to you? Are you okay? Are you sick? And I'm better than I've been in years, and was anxious to tell them how I did it with a low carb approach without medication and all that.
Well, let me say, I probably hear from more diabetics than most doctors do. I mean, they're commenting all the time by the hundreds and by the thousands. And, what you're describing is rare even for me in all that I've heard. I've heard of people that got down into the 4s fairly quickly, but from 9.9 to 4.9, 5-point drop in 4 months' time, is just over the moon. It's just amazing. And, if I didn't know what I know about how effective this is, you might be tempted to say, you're surely wrong. There's got to be a mistake here.
Right.
But I've heard it enough that I know, this really works. And you've had A1C since then?
Yes, always in the low 5s, 5.1 in that range.
Yeah.
And because remember, during that first 4-month period, I was, doing these like 48 and 72-hour fasts, and I haven't done that since I got that A1C of a 4.9. I haven't. I've done some 1 meal a days. I do that quite often. In fact, not every day. Maybe 4 days a week or something. I'll do 1 meal a day, and on the days when I'm eating meals, I try to keep the eating window narrower, maybe to a 8-hour or 6-hour window. Yeah.
Now, when you do a 6-hour window of eating, what do you do? Just skip breakfast and start in with like a noon or a 12:30 lunch?
Yes. Well, I never eat breakfast at breakfast time anymore. Black coffee is my breakfast, and even on the days when I'll have a longer window, like on the weekend when I'm off work, I'll wait until around 10:30 to have breakfast. I just have black coffee when I first get up, and at 7 o'clock in the morning, 6:30, 7, I'll have black coffee, and then around 10:30 we might have bacon and eggs or something like that. But and then try not to go past a certain time in the evening, so that it's a shorter window, like an 8-hour window at the most. Now what I did after the diagnosis was I stumbled across that number of a maximum of 20 carbs a day, and that was my goal. And I watched my carbs like crazy.
Now you're talking net carbs or total carbs?
Total carbs. I know about net carbs. I know, like peanuts, because of the fiber and different things like that. But I tried to focus on total carbs. And so that was pretty extreme, really, and I still do that. I still try to keep my carbs very low, because I know if I went back to eating wrong, I probably would be right back in the shape that I was in before, and I just don't want to go there.
Right. Well, you used no medication to get where you are, and you had some other benefits. Your blood pressure, you don't take blood pressure medication. Yes. You were taking 2, now you're taking 0, and you still have good blood pressure.
Yes, and all my blood work has improved, which that wasn't even my goal. My goal was to keep that blood sugar in line, but all my blood work has improved. My doctor used to tell me, well, you're getting the old man disease, your testosterone levels are getting lower every time I see you. And that was another thing he was shocked with at that visit where I got the 4.9 on my A1C. He goes, your testosterone levels have shot way up, and
really?
And I was shocked by that too. Because he said that's another thing I've never seen before, and he said we just accept that older men start losing testosterone level, and he said I've never seen somebody's testosterone level go up like that. And so that was a pleasant surprise as well, and wasn't even a goal that I had. But
well, you had that. You had the blood pressure. You had the blood sugar, and I think there was one other thing. Was it cholesterol or something?
Cholesterol.
Or
yes, I used to take a statin for cholesterol, and I'm able to get off of that now as well.
Well, it's kind of funny because there are some people that act like keto or low carb, extreme low carb eating is going to be so dangerous and it's going to mess you up. But every one of your blood lipids and all the indicators of health have improved, not just slightly but dramatically for you.
Yes, and I can't promise that it would work that way for everybody, but I myself and my doctor were both really pleasantly surprised at how all of my blood work improved dramatically. And psychologically, as you can imagine, that was a huge boost for me, because I realized there really is something that I can do about this. I don't have to just accept that I'm on a downhill slope towards the grave. There are things I can do to enjoy the rest of my life at a higher level and be more effective and help other people and all of that.
And I think the thing that screams out from your story to all the people that are newly diagnosed, they're scared to death, they don't know what to do, the thing that screams out from your story is the word hope. Yes. I mean, there is hope, because a lot of people think diabetes is automatically a no-hope death sentence or, a misery sentence. And look
Absolutely.
At you. You're feeling better than you ever have, it sounds to me like.
Absolutely. I'm now at the weight and everything that I was in my 20s. I did a little bit of time in the military in my 20s, and I pulled out my uniform the other day to see if I could fit in it, because I haven't been able to fit in that in years, but it fit perfectly now,
Wow.
So that and I was wearing that in my early 20s. So.
Wow. You've got a YouTube channel of your own we want to steer people to. Tell us where we can find. I'll put a link in the description, but tell us a little bit about it.
I just started that about 10 days ago, and I've got about 13 videos up so far, and I'll be adding more and more content there. I did that initially because I get so many questions about what did you do, and it's hard, especially in the office seeing patients, it's hard for me to explain everything, and so I thought it'd be good if I had the ability to send them to a YouTube channel and say, watch this and get my story, get the full details.
Yeah. Very, very cool. Well, we appreciate you, my friend, and thanks for coming out on this, in the middle of all this COVID situation, and being willing to share your story. It's a treat for me to come to this park. I haven't been here in a while, so thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure, and it is indeed a beautiful setting.
Wasn't that powerful? And one statement Bill made bears repeating, so let's rewind it and play it again.
I know if I went back to eating wrong, I probably would be right back in the shape that I was in before, and I just don't want to go there.
Right. When Bill sent me some pictures to use with the interview, there was one particular picture that gave me a little extra insight as to why he beat diabetes so quickly and so thoroughly. And it was this picture. Bill revealed that he often used 2 different glucose monitors just to make sure they were accurate. And anybody who's that sincere and that conscientious about glucose testing is almost certainly going to be able to beat diabetes. Well done, Bill.